turn the tail piece right side out. And you're now ready to stuff the tail and the legs. Before you start stuffing the legs, be sure to fluff your polyfill. This means to tear it into tiny pieces to remove any clumps. This will help improve the shape of your plush. You don't want to fill the legs too full. You want to keep about the top ½ inch open so that you can attach it to the body of the sloth. You can fill the rest of the leg tightly or loosely depending on your preference. Go ahead and repeat this for all the legs as well as the tail. We're now ready to add the claw marks to the claws. I do this by stitching 2 lines with embroidery floss. What I like to do first is take my air erase marker and mark on the claw where I'd like it to go. So I just draw my line, and this will give me a guide while I'm stitching. I do so on both sides. This way I can make sure it matches up at the top. And I'm ready to begin. I've threaded a doll needle with a single strand of embroidery floss. I haven't knotted it yet. I'm going to do that later as we're stitching, so I'm going to leave it as it is right now. I find doll needles work really great. They're a little bit longer than regular needles, which makes them easy to work with for this. I'm going to start by inserting the needle on the right-hand side at the base. I'm not going to go all the way through. I'm just going to poke it inside, and then I'm going to angle my needle up so that it comes out at that center seam at the top of my line. And I'm going to pull it through until I have about a 3-inch thread tail remaining. Then I'm going to go back and do the exact same thing again. So I'm going to move my thread tail out of the way, and I'm going to enter again at the same point and exit at the same point. Pull your needle through so that the thread is snug. You can guide it to rest over your line. Turn the claw over, and on that same side where it's exiting the fabric, follow that line down to the bottom and poke your needle through. This time you're going to go all the way straight through the whole claw, and you're going to poke it through on the front right at our starting point. Pull it snug so that your thread lies along the line, and then look at your front side again. Now take your embroidery floss and tie a knot using the thread tail. Insert your needle back into the same spot. Don't go all the way through, just go under the fabric, and point the end of the needle up so that it goes to the second line on the same side. So straight across like this. That looks like mine went a little far. Let's straighten it out. There we go. Pull it through. And next we're going to go down through the top. So follow this line up to your seam and poke it down. turn the cloth over and pull it out towards the front. Poke it out at the bottom of the line on the other side and pull it through. Check to make sure the thread looks good. Guide it back to the top so that it meets the edge of the stitch you just finished. And poke it through to exit out the front, just on the bottom of the side that has the thread tail already. Move the pile out of the way if necessary and tie yourself a knot. Then, to hide your thread tail, insert your needle at that same place right next to your knot. And exit out the side of the arm. Pull it through, tug it so it's a little snug, and then trim off the embroidery floss close to where it's exiting the fabric. Be careful not to cut your pile. And now the thread tail is hidden. We're gonna do the same thing and hide the thread tail on the other side. The way I like to do this is take my needle and I'm going to insert it right where my first knot was and exit it out the side of the arm. I'm not going to pull it all the way through though. When it's halfway down like this, I'm going to thread my needle with the thread tail. So I'm going to use my needle threader. And pull that thread tail through the eye of the needle. And then I'm going to go ahead and finish pulling my needle through. And we now have our claws. And the nice thing about using this method, you don't have to use this method, you could use any method you want. But the nice thing about this is that it's secured at the top so that your embroidery floss doesn't slide down. So complete this for all 4 legs. Let's attach the legs to the body. Start with the belly piece. Lay it right side up. The narrow side is the top edge that's going to be next to the face. The wider edge will be at the bottom of the sloth next to the tail. Let's attach the tail to the belly. First, take your tail, make sure you have your stuffing in there, and make sure it doesn't come all the way to the end because you're going to sew there. Pinch it closed and align it with the bottom edge so that it's centered. And pin it in place. Stitch it in place with a seam allowance that's just a little bit smaller than 1/4 of an inch. When sewing with fur, it can be a bit of a challenge sewing on the right side, so double check to make sure you went through all the layers when you attach the tail. Let's go ahead and continue with the legs. Mark 1/2 inch from the top edge. That's going to be the position for the front leg. On the sloth, the front legs are longer than the back legs. So choose the longer legs. Also, if you added Velcro double check to see which sides align. So if you have your Velcro or snaps on this side where they touch, make sure that your legs are in the appropriate position so they'll match when you're done. You want the curved edge of the legs to be pointing towards the front. So the arms and legs will be pointing away from the tail. Align the edge of the leg so that it lines up with the edge of the belly piece. The front edge of the leg will line up with your pin, so it will be a 1/2 inch away from the front there. Pin or clip it in place. Make sure it goes through the fabric and not just the fluff of the fur. Then measure a 1/2 inch from the bottom. This will be where the back legs line up. The back legs are shorter but still face the same direction, so the curve is going towards the front. Align the raw edge of the leg with the raw edge of the belly piece. And pin in place. Baste both legs in place with a seam allowance that's just a little bit smaller than 1/4 inch. Once you've sewn the 2 legs in place, move them out of the way. Grab the other 2 legs and attach them in the same manner. Make sure they're going the right direction with the curve pointing towards the front. Keep the 1/2 inch away from the edge, just like before. Since sewing fur is slippery and the fabric can slide around, once you're done, make sure to double check that all of the layers have been sewn together and that nothing slid out of place. Once all 4 legs are attached, get ready to add the back piece. On the back piece, the edge that has the little point, that's going to go up by the face, so that will go towards the front, and then the edge that's flat will be back by the tail. And the skinny part will match the skinny part here. So turn it so that right sides are together. Again, the point should be going towards the front. Align the side edge and pin in place. What I like to do is take a few pins to hold it initially. And then once I get the basic placement, I like to use pin basting just like I did before. So I'm going to start sewing here. So when I start pinning, I'm going to sew here, and I want all of the points of the pin to point this way. And I'm going to double check to make sure I've got all of my layers included. And then I'm going to weave my pins. I'm going to double check on the back to make sure it's going through all of those layers. And you can adjust your original pins if you need to. When you're sewing this edge, you have to be a little careful. Sometimes the weight of the legs can pull it out of shape. And so as you're sewing, you may need to adjust the position frequently and keep an eye on it to make sure that the area you're sewing stays nice and flat. Okay, and now that I'm ready, I'm going to head to the sewing machine and sew this in place with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Once you've sewn the edge in place, double check to make sure it's all attached securely and you can't see the basting stitches for the legs. So I've got to move the legs out of the way, so I'm going to move the front legs to the front, the back legs to the back, and then fold this over and align the other side of the back piece with the other side of the belly. This can take a little maneuvering, so just take your time and make sure to align it as best you can. once you've got it all pinned in place, it's time to sew. Just keep in mind that since these legs are moved out of the way, it could pull on your seam a little bit more than when you sewed the first time. So keep an eye on that. Make sure everything's nice and flat when you're sewing. Once both sides are sewn, tuck the legs down so that they're pointing towards the front. And we're ready to add the bottom piece. So make sure that the legs are out of the way for the bottom section. On the bottom piece, sew your 4 darts just like you did when you were constructing the face. This will help give it a curved shape. Next, what I like to do is mark the centers. I like to do this from the wrong side, but I'm just going to take a pin and put it in the center here, as well as take a pin and put it in the center here. Before I sew on the bottom piece, the next thing I have to do is fix my little mix-up with the tail. I accidentally sewed the tail to the belly piece. I want it to go on the back piece instead. So I've removed the tail, and I'm going to find the center of the back piece right here. And I'm going to line up the tail so that it's right sides together, right at the center there. And then I'll baste it in place like I did before, but this time it'll be on the right side. So I'm going to head to the machine and fix that, and then when I get back we can add the bottom. Now that I've fixed the position of my tail, I'm ready to add the bottom piece. The first thing I'm going to do is mark the centers. So the back center will be right in the middle of the tail, so I'm going to put a pin right there to mark the center back. And then to mark the center of the belly, I'm going to pinch these 2 edges together at the seam allowance and then fold it in half. And right there will be the center of the belly. And now I'm ready to add the bottom piece. So I've got my bottom piece here. I want to place it right sides together. That means the furry sides will be touching, and I'm going to align my pins. So I'm going to take my bottom piece and I'm going to align it so right sides are touching. So I'm going to line it with the center back first, and I'm just going to line up those pins and pin it together. And then I'm going to take my other center and align it with the center belly. And pin it in place. And then I'm going to pin all the way around. And we're going to sew all the way around with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. Since we've left the opening on the side, we're going to sew all the way around this base here. You may need to stop frequently to adjust your fabric to make sure it's laying flat. Once you've sewn the bottom, check all the way around to make sure there aren't any holes. If you need to touch anything up or straighten it up, go ahead and do that. And then flip it over. Stuff all the arms and legs inside. And now we're ready to add the face. You're going to add the face in the same way, so make sure that you mark the centers on the back and belly piece. So on the belly, I'm just going to fold it like I did before. On the back, it's really easy to find. On your back piece, the center is that peak. When I mark the center here, I'm going to try to be as exact as I can because a 1/4 inch down from this peak is where the valley on the face needs to go. So I'm going to mark this exactly a 1/4 inch down and put in my pin. Then I'm going to grab the face and I'm going to mark my centers. So again, the center of the face is usually pretty easy to find. It is the valley. So I'm going to mark exactly right at that valley on the face. And then on the bottom, I'm just going to fold it to find halfway. And then I'm going to line up my pieces. I'm going to start by aligning the peak on the back with the valley on the face. You want to make sure they're right sides together. So furry side is the right side, and then the side with the decorations is the right side. I'm going to line up those two places. To help make this fit, right at the top of the face, I'm going to move my pin for just a second. Right at the top of the face, I'm going to do a little slit. I'm not going to cut all the way through that 1/4 inch, just about halfway or so. And that is going to allow my fabric to bend around the peak of the back. So you can see now it's got a little slit there, which will allow for some movement. So I'm going to find the peak at the back. There it is. And I'm going to place them right sides together. So there's the peak at the back and the valley of the face. And I'm going to align them up so that those 2 points match. So it's going to look a little bit like the back's extending too far, but it's really not. And center that as best you can. And then angle the edge of the face, so turn it to follow the edge of the back at the raw edges. I like to just do a couple pins, and then I'm going to turn it the other direction on the other side of the peak. Align it with the edge of the back piece. And that kind of gets the head started in position. And then on the bottom of the face, align it with the center at the bottom of the belly. And pin it in place. And then pin all the way around. Make sure as you're pinning that you're aligning the edge of the fleece with the edge of the fabric and not with just the fluff. Once you have it all pinned in place, head to the sewing machine and sew around the edge with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. As you're sewing this section, you may need to stop frequently to readjust your fabric. Since the legs are all stuffed inside, it can make it a little bulky, which can be a bit of a challenge. So just go slow, take your time, follow your lines as you sew, and if you need to, fix it later if there are any imperfections. You can also sew this by hand if you prefer. Once everything's been attached and you've checked to make sure there are no holes, you can go ahead and turn your sloth right side out. Carefully pull the legs through the opening to the outside. Check to make sure that everything looks good and that there are no holes. If you're happy with the way your sloth is constructed, go ahead and stuff. Don't forget to fluff your polyfill first. Once you've stuffed your sloth the way you'd like to, it's time to go ahead and close up that opening. So we're just going to slip stitch the side closed here. If you need more information on how to do a slip stitch, you can see my skill building video, which is linked below. As you do your slip stitch, make sure that you are stitching through the backing of the fur fabric and not just the fluff. Our sloth is just about done. You'll notice that sometimes when you're working on plush projects, that the pile of the fur will get caught in the seam allowance, and this can make it look a little funny in some areas because the fur is tucked down into that seam when it should be fluffed out. So the next thing we're going to do is pull that out. You can use your fingernail, you can use the side of a pin. I'm going to be using my purple thing, but I'm just going to run it along the edge of the seams to very gently pull out those fur fibers so that they're not tucked inside. You may have to be a little bit more careful doing this if you have a long pile on your fur. This one's pretty short, so usually if you just rub it, it will come right off. But this can make a big difference on the appearance of your plush and give it the fuzziness that you want. So go ahead and do that on all the seams, and that will help with your final appearance. It will also help to hide some of those seams. So for example, here on the front leg, you can see it tucked inside. If you rub along the edge of it, those little fur fibers pop out, and then the seam is less visible. So I'm going to go ahead and do that on my entire sloth. Next, if you'd like to, we can add magnets to the sloth. If you've already added magnets, Velcro, or snaps, then you're done. If you want to add the magnets now, I'll show you how. To add the magnets by hand, the first thing you want to do is get some fabric to cover the magnets. I'm just using a regular cotton fabric, and I'm going to cut a circle to go over my magnets. You want to make sure that the circle is big enough to account for the width of the magnet as well as to leave a little seam allowance. Next, I'm going to stitch around the circle with a running stitch. I'm going to keep my stitches about 1/8 of an inch away from the edge and about 1/2 centimeter to 1 centimeter long. I'm also making sure that I use coordinating thread because I don't want this to be visible on the outside of my sloth. Once I have the running stitch completed, when you pull it a little, it pulls in the sides of that circle, kind of like a little cup, and I'm going to place my magnet inside. Before you close it up, check your magnets on your sloth. If you have any attached already, make sure that they attach. So I can see this one, it's repelling it rather than connecting to it, so I need to flip my magnet over, and now that sticks really good, so I know my magnet's going the correct way. Now I'll pull my thread tight, and I'm going to trim off a little bit of my excess fabric, careful not to cut my stitches. And then to help pull this fabric really snug, what I like to do is go around the edge one more time. So I'm just gonna slide my needle through some of these little folds that go around, but I'm going to do so a little bit closer to the edge, not right in the center. And I'm just going to go around the circle. And then I'm going to pull it nice and snug. so that fabric lays as flat as it can. And then I'm going to go ahead and tie my knot. Once your knot's been tied, you can cut it and get more thread, or since my thread's long enough, I'm just gonna go ahead and do a stitch along the side. I'm gonna slip stitch this to the sloth, and I'm gonna slip stitch around the top edge of the circle. So there's the back face of the magnet, the front face of the magnet, and I'm gonna be stitching around the circumference of the front face. So I'm gonna have my needle come out right on the edge there, around the front of the circle. And then I'm going to set it where I want it, and I'm going to leave a little space away from the edge because since this is plush, when I do that stitch around the top circle, it's going to kind of sink in. So you can see it here on one I've already done. You can't see the width of the magnet. It's like sunk down into the claw there because I did the slip stitch along that front face. So to give the fleece space to come up over the side of that magnet, I'm going to leave about 1/8 of an inch or so away from the bottom for that fabric to be able to curl up a bit. And then I'm just going to slip stitch around. And when I do my slip stitch, I'm going to think about the height of my magnet here, and I'm going to do my stitches about that far away from my circle. And then when I pull the stitch in, the fabric will come on up and over. The nice thing about using this method to attach the magnets is you don't have to worry about it getting in the way when you're sewing the rest of the sloth, which can be a bit of a challenge. So I'm going to go ahead and just stitch all the way around. I'm moving my embroidery floss out of the way for as I need to, and I'll make sure to put that back once I'm done. But I'm just going to sew a circle all the way around. Make sure to pull it good and snug so that it goes up over the sides of that magnet. Once I've slip stitched around the circle once, I like to go around it again just to make sure it's good and strong and it's not going to come loose. And this time when I sew around, I like to alternate the position of my stitches. So on my first round where the stitch went into the magnet fabric, I'm going to put it on the fleece fabric and vice versa. So it's going to swap the place where it was. So the stitches that went through the fleece last time, in that spot I'm going to stitch through the magnet fabric this time, just to help it get a more finished look around that magnet. So I'm going to make my first stitch teeny tiny to help offset that. And now we have magnets on our sloth. If you've enjoyed this project, keep an eye on future videos where we may make some accessories for our sloth. I hope you've enjoyed this project. Happy sewing!